Okay, so at this point in the process, we should have already pretty much gone over the whole kind of speed sculpt section of it, or I've sped it up. I'll probably end up going back and slowing down those sections and talking over them, but I don't know because hindsight's 2020, so we'll figure it out later. But at this point, I have all of my subtools renamed. I went and actually I have found a Z plugin that does a batch rename, which is pretty dope. It allows you to basically choose a prefix or a suffix, and then it searches that, deletes it, and then you can actually add in your own, which I thought was incredibly convenient. Um, it's right here. Sorry, batch rename. You can like add and remove. So I'll put that in the description as well, since that is something I had to do manually up until this point, which is such a pain in my butt. But anyways, I also, besides the rename, I went in and I actually set the polygroups because we want to make sure we actually bake out an ID map. The only thing I really care about for this particular piece is making sure that all the yellowish greenish colors, I mean, they're slightly different. You know, you got like a greenish yellow tint. Well, this is fully yellow. As long as it's pretty close, that's all I care about. I'm trying to make sure all those are coming through so I can basically select the color yellow as part of my ID, and then that becomes the metal, right? So once I have those masked out, I'm pretty much good to go from there. So I don't really care about doing the wood since the rest of the entire piece is wooden. That makes it a lot easier to work with as well. And the way you can do this is you can actually do, I just did auto groups after I combined everything, or after I had the final high poly. And then from there, if you actually come down to poly groups, sorry, poly paint right here, you can do poly paint from poly groups. If you just click on it, it'll actually choose that color. So that's good. Also, some final comments. I ended up going in and mirroring a few things, which you'll see when I open up Maya and I show you what I mirrored. One of those things is this front side. You're hardly ever going to see this front side, especially from like directly on it. So I decided to just mirror it over. I figured that'd be a lot easier. And then I know early on in the videos, I also covered mirroring this front wheel. I ended up putting a metal piece on there to kind of combine the whole thing, which made it look a lot nicer. And then I decided, hey, I'm just going to mirror it from this right side over to the left side, since again, you'll never actually see the wheel from head on to figure out which side is which. So that kind of obvious tiling isn't really all that obvious actually. So anyway, I'm pretty happy with this final result. I think it'll come up with a good bake. It's also worth noting that I don't really care a whole lot about the lumpiness all that much. It's only going to be a 1024 texture, so a lot of that won't really come through as much. And besides, this is mainly just to drive forward the so much diffuse that I'll be covering in this video, which is what I use to kind of set up the base for my hand painted stuff. So I like to think that most of the texture definition actually comes from the diffuse layer, not the normal map, since I'm not really using any metalness or roughness with it anyway. Okay, so at this point, I've already exported it, but I'll just show you really quick. I do Z plugin, FBX import export. This way it actually keeps all the different subtools grouped up. And again, it's really important to have these suffixes, which I mentioned early on in some of the other videos. And I just do it by visible, and then I do FBX 2019, and then just go ahead and hit export, and then I'll pull up a menu to figure out where you want to save it, and then just go from there. So now that that's out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and grab Maya and then actually cover what I did here. So I decided just to kind of mirror some things over just so I can visualize it as I'm texturing it, and then I decided just to go the full distance and bring it over. So some things like this are pretty obviously mirrored. I don't really care. I'm just going to kind of mirror. I'm going to flip it over. I'm going to slide it up here and flip it. So it's going to use the same texture, which is why in the ZBrush I actually ended up only doing one of these bands. The reason I have these bands roughly placed though, and other things in here, is because you want to make sure when you're baking all of your high poly stuff onto your low poly, even though you may be repeating some of the UVs, like for example, I'll be using the exact same texture on all these little metal brackets. You want to still have that high poly piece there, just because it's going to influence the ambient occlusion and the curvature and all that stuff when you actually go to bake it. So even though it may just be a placeholder, you want to try and make sure that it's roughly set up the way you would expect it in the low poly, because otherwise you're going to have a situation where some of the AO is not baking through, or some of the yeah, honestly, it's just some of the AO. So I hope that kind of makes sense. I don't really need it in this case because I'm actually mirroring it over. But since all of these boards are unique UVs, I actually needed to go ahead and place that bracket and slid it over. So even though it doesn't match up to the low poly, the high poly is there to try and influence the ambient occlusion that I'll be baking. So sorry, I forgot to mention that. So in this case, I went ahead and actually slid the low poly up since I want to actually visualize where the AO is going to be on there as well. Went ahead and mirrored this over. So that's there. Actually, I probably should go ahead and make these soft edges as well. Yeah, that's a lot better looking. So I have that. Trying to think if I should go over any tips at all, because I realized my UV map is on the other monitor. So I'm going to actually go ahead and slide this over. So something that I actually do when I unwrap, I know I learned for when I'm working with Substance Painter is anytime you have something that's going to be mirrored, you want to make sure that one of the shells or whatever the mirrored shells, those are always on the other side or in the 1 to 2 space for the UV map. So if you'll notice here that when I actually select the front of this wheel, this actually takes place in the 1 to 1 and 1 to 2 space. I'll put the checkers on here. The reason being is because this is every time you tile a UV space, you're tiling the texture over and over and over again. So the UVs, no matter where they are on this map, as long as they're in the exact same spot, just in a different tile set, they'll take those UVs, right? But when Substance Painter goes to bake, it's only going to bake things onto the things that are in the 1 to 1 space, meaning it's not going to take influence from this side of the geometry. It's only going to say, okay, I see that these shells right here are on the left side, so the 1 to 1 space, and so regardless of how many variants of or stacked shells are on this mesh, I'm only going to look at this part of the mesh when baking it. This one's kind of a poor example, but a good example are these brackets right here. So I have actually 3 of these brackets, as you'll notice. And oh man, I actually didn't even move them over. So it's going to have a tough time baking these because it thinks all these are going to be unique meshes, but in reality they use the same UV space, right? So in this case, if you go to this side, this is pretty heavily occluded up here on this upper part, but if you come to this side, it seems a bit more open. So it's going to have a tough time figuring out, okay, which mesh do I look at when I'm trying to bake the ambient occlusion or the curvature or any other information that's dependent on the world space or the world space location of the meshes. So in this case, it's going to be grabbing ambient occlusion from this one, and then, okay, it's going to look at this one in comparison to these boards and all this stuff. So it's going to be a whole mess. You're going to have a ton of different artifacts from the bake, and it's going to look really ugly. So what I do is I select the one that I want to be, I guess, like the main baker, and then I will just shift select the other ones. So then it actually inverses the selection, and I will actually grab the, oops, that's the wrong toolkit. I'll grab the UV toolkit, and then I'm going to go ahead and actually just slide these over by one whole unit. Something to keep in mind too is you want to make sure that your whole UV layout is finalized. So something you'll notice with mine is that what I always do is I come in here and I will make sure this whole thing is laid out properly, and then once I get everything in the right spot, I'll actually go in one by one and I go, okay, what am I mirroring? What am I flipping over? What needs to be on the 1 to 2 space? And then I'll just simply pick one that I think is the right shell, and then I'll just mirror it and then slide it over one. So in this case, I've already gone through and done that. So everything here is basically where it needs to be. So all of my main bakers and all of the unique UVs are on the left side, and anything that's actually stacking on top of other UVs is going to be here on the right side. But again, it's going to be okay because all this does is actually just affect the bake. The actual textures will come on here just fine, and then when I come back into Maya for my final round trip, just for the sake of remaining clean, I'll come in here and I'll boop, just slide those back over again. So I'm actually going to go ahead and select all of these, make sure all my naming conventions are correct, which they aren't. Here we go. And then I'm going to go ahead and actually clear history, freeze transforms, reset the transforms, go to the middle because you want to make sure that the pivots are all the same from the high poly and the low poly. Freeze my history, and then I'm going to actually export the selection. And then I'm going to go into wheelbarrow, And I'm going to do WB low because that's what I did. So I've already done a test bake on this, so I kind of know how it's going to turn out. Something that actually helped me a lot with lining up the location of these low polys is I actually just did a really, really rough bake of the high poly and the low poly, and it actually helped me determine where all of those, AO marks are, and then kind of the curvature and all the other things. So I already had a nice excuse for that. And I can even show it to you. It's this one right here. Oops. So I already kind of went through and did this whole thing. So there's that. In the next video, I'm actually gonna start pretty in depth covering what so much diffuse is and what I do to kind of set it up. And then after that, I'll probably do a sped up version of setting the rest of the so much diffuse up, and then in the final set of videos, I'll be talking about hand painting over it and what I do and kind of showing you my whole process. So I will see you guys in the next video.